President Cyril Ramaphosa is concluding his visit to the UN General Assembly after a packed itinerary that saw him speak at the Summit of the Future, deliver the country's statement at the General Assembly, co-host a G20 Foreign Ministers meeting, and engage with business leaders, including billionaire Elon Musk, about investing in the country. The final entry on his New York itinerary is an exclusive sit-down with SABC News' Sherwin Rice-Peace to discuss his visit and more broadly the country's foreign policy. Sherwin, over to you.
Bongiwe, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And in what has now become a tradition here in New York, when the President of South Africa concludes his visit to the United Nations General Assembly and his engagement with business here in New York, he sits down with SABC News only to say, President Cyril Ramaphosa, welcome back to SABC News. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you, Sherwin. Thank you.
We'll certainly get to your engagement at the United Nations in a moment, but I want to argue that the constant thread throughout your visit to New York over the last 4 days has been economic diplomacy. Key meetings with investors in terms of mineral value chains in the context of the transition to renewables and South Africa's desire for greater foreign direct investment as a key enabler of inclusive economic growth. You told investors on Monday that the level of confidence, be that business confidence or the confidence that ordinary South Africans now have as a result of the government of national unity, is on the rise. Explain your thinking, Mr. President, in that regard.
Well, when we come to the United Nations, we always have a number of other activities. And you're absolutely right. The theme really is a balanced theme, both political as well as economic. And as it happens, we are also accompanied by a number of South African business people who use this opportunity to come to the UN to interface with a number of US-based businesses and business people, and US business people invested in South Africa, and those who would like to invest also see this as a watering well to come together. So it's an economic watering well, really, in many ways.
So you came with an empty bucket?
We came with an empty bucket. So they also use this opportunity to interact with us. And it so happens that much as it's not a state visit, it's an important visit to a UN international organization where a number of ministers come. So we use this opportunity then to hold business engagements with business. And the highlight this year was going to the New York Stock Exchange, where up to 7 South African businesses are listed on the biggest stock exchange in the world, where they come to raise money. And it was also important for us to talk to business people who came to the stock exchange and to inform them about the developments in South Africa, and particularly what the Government of National Unity era is going to be focusing on, which is economic growth, job creation, and strengthening of government work. So we found the reception very positive and very warm and welcoming, much as people may have been a bit concerned before the elections, fearing what could happen in South Africa. But now people are much more relaxed, and business interest in South Africa, as you correctly say, is on the rise. So we were in a sweet spot, as they say, and this also was accompanied by meeting various sectors, focus on mining, focus on renewable energy, and focus just on a whole number of other areas of our economic life.
Let's interrogate that sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
We heard that the South African economy was at an inflection point. Minister Parks Tau also mentioned that the runway was very short. To essentially get things right, Mr. President, our country suffers from vast inequities, unemployment is worryingly high, crime is endemic, infrastructure deficits from ports to rail to road remain major impediments to the ease of doing business. You were clear that these issues were being addressed, but I imagine, Mr. President, that they cannot be addressed fast enough. We hear some sectors of our society calling for an economic rupture. that is needed to fundamentally transform the current system that is simply not working for the poor majority in South Africa. Do you believe that an economic rupture is necessary, and if so, what might that look like?
Well, an economic rupture seems to suggest to me that we want everything to break apart, and that is certainly not the trajectory that we have embarked on. We've embarked on an economic build-up, an economic strengthening, economic growth, where we want to have all the levers to address the economic challenges that face our country. Some of those are the lack of reforms. We haven't had reforms in a number of years. And if you look at a number of economies around the world, they have embarked on their own reforms. The economy is an organism that is in constant change, and it needs to be strengthened, it needs to be broadened, and it needs to be moved in a particular direction, which is particularly what we are doing now through the reforms and focusing on engendering growth through bedding down the reforms in electricity, bedding down reforms in water, bedding down the reforms also in logistics. So once all those, including visa regimes and many others, are combined together, they become real engines of growth. But they also make our country more attractive to investors. So if you break down everything, everybody stands back and say, we want to see the dust settling first. What we need to do is to build up, to ensure that infrastructure projects take off the ground, to ensure that we move faster with our reforms and not tarry and not wait. And the new spirit of enthusiasm and focus is being unleashed in the country right now. People are feeling much more hopeful. Investors are feeling hopeful, and we can see the rising level of interest. And of course, we need to capture that and make it a reality. Nearly everyone in the government of national unity and even in provinces, they are rearing to go. And that is the moment that South Africa should capture and not lose. Because if we lose this could well be the last train out of town. So we must catch this train and make sure that we move on with what we now know. The things that beset our country are not unknown, they are known. And all we need to do is to embark on the changes that are necessary with greater determination, but with greater ambition. And I'm telling the ministers in government that we need to raise our ambition. If, for instance, they say growth could be 2% or 3%, we must ask ourselves, what is it that we can do to catapult it to a higher level? So that is now raising our eyes beyond the horizon and saying, we are going to work a lot harder. Right. We are going to walk an extra kilometer to make sure that things happen.
And I think we can all agree 2% is not going to break unemployment in South Africa. 2%. So we definitely need to be more ambitious. Let me ask you this, Mr. President. You talked about the country's debt to GDP ratio when you were at the New York Stock Exchange, which is heading towards around 73% currently. And so a balancing act between fiscal responsibility, the cost of servicing that debt, while there are, of course, serious developmental and social needs in South Africa, it's a bit like being a trapeze artist, right? That balancing act, and it's often the most vulnerable that suffer in that scenario. You say you're focused on reducing the debt servicing costs. It's a broad developmental concern that even the SG, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has been very vocal about and is very much backing that. Are you seeing any movement in that regard? Because it'll free up money to go towards the Sustainable Development Goals, will it not?
Well, freeing up money towards development and meeting the needs of our people is the key objective that we have in mind. Because when we free up that money, we're then able to borrow less.
Right.
And when we borrow less, our debt servicing costs reduce and go down. And we're already beginning to see, for instance, with the interest rates coming down, we're able to see that our debt servicing costs, the cost of money is no longer sort of at a high premium. It's tapering down. So we can see some breathing space there. But in the end, it is the growth of the economy that is going to count most. When we grow our economy, when we open the levers of real growth in the economy, where our revenue levels will start going up and the need to take more debt then begins to go down. But at the same time, focusing on, yes, meeting the needs of our people and spending the money. The money spent on a number of programs has either been stalled or has been going down. The most part has been going down. We need to be spending a little bit more, but with the increased revenues. So it's a very delicate balancing act, but we need to reach that point.
Mr. President, you met with Elon Musk, the South African-born entrepreneur who has a vast portfolio of interests that has made him one of the richest men in the world. Let me tell you, when I put this on social media that you were meeting him, it went viral. People are very interested in that meeting. Tell us what you told him and tell us how he responded.
Well, meeting Elon Musk was a clear intention of mine because I had spoken to him on the phone, and when I came to New York, I said I'd like to meet him. It's a whole process. Some people call it a bromance. It's a whole process of rekindling his affection and connection with South Africa. And of course, it can be a love affair. It can be an investment relationship. Businesses are invested in many parts of the world. And so he is a top layer business person who is very entrepreneurial and would like to interest him more in South Africa in a variety of areas. And he's already looking at our country with some interest in a number of sectors.
Starlink, for example,
for instance,
Tesla?
in telecoms, in car, the auto industry. Yes, those are some of the areas that we spoke about. Nothing has been bedded down yet. And as it happens with potential investors, you've got to court them. You've got to be talking to them. You've got to be demonstrating to them that there is a conducive environment for them to invest. So we'll see how this turns out.
I mean, he's a very controversial figure. I know you probably know he's very involved in America, the U.S. election right now, very involved in supporting former President Donald Trump's trajectory in that election. Have you invited him to South Africa? I mean, how does this bromance develop?
Yes, of course. I mean, he's South African born, and
right.
South Africa is his home, as it were. And so I'd like to see him come to South Africa for a visit or a tour or whatever. And he goes to China quite often. And so I said,
Tesla's very big. I think they've got a factory in China, in Shanghai, I believe.
They built a factory in China. So our discussions are at the sort of embryonic level on a number of issues, and we hope to see some progress going forward.
Mr. President, you are soon to assume the chairmanship or the presidency of the G20, and I've already said that you would use this important role to advocate for the people of Africa and for all of the global South under the theme Solidarity, Equality and Sustainable Development. What must the G20 achieve by the time you hand over the reins to the United States at the end of next year?
I would like them to focus quite a lot on those three themes, because we want to see more solidarity from your global North countries that have become very well developed economically, have become very rich, and some of those riches obviously were created by dint of their activities around the world. And so we would like to see more cooperation, more collaboration, and more solidarity with us in the global South, but especially in Africa, and of course our own country, South Africa. So solidarity will mean on issues like climate change, on issues like development, on issues like financing of development, as well as recalibrating the governance institutions of the world the UN, the financial institutions, and making Africa participate in a much more meaningful way.
Right.
So that for us is solidarity. And of course, equality means that we'd like as nations to be treated equally. But we would like the peoples of the various countries in the world to also be treated equally, without any form of racism and without any form of oppression and exploitation. And the sustainable development speaks for itself, because we want to be more and more of a developmental sort of group of nations, focusing on the development of our people, growing our economies and trading a lot on much better terms with the global north, because the global north at times closes up their markets for our entry, and sometimes those markets are made dependent on a number of conditions.
Right.
And we are saying, we'd like to trade with you just as much as you trade with us. So we want that sustainable development with them.
And of course, the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes catalytic in that regard. Mm-hmm. Let's develop this equality part of your theme for the G20. And let's talk about that in the context of your relationship with the United States. What's your understanding of where matters stand with the U.S. more broadly? You appear to have emerged from a period of political tension stemming from, of course, the docking of the Lady R in Simonstown. There's been a flurry of activity, several visits by cabinet officials to Washington. Former Minister Patel, now his successor, Minister Tao, Minister Lamola spent a week there and described the relationship as dynamic and evolving. How do you characterize the relationship now, and how important is it to your government that South Africa remains as a party and a recipient in the African Growth and Opportunity Act?
Well, remaining as a party to the African Growth and Development Act, the United States, AGOA that is, is very important for us. It allows our producers and exporters to export a number of goods, including services, that they export to the United States. So we are guarding that whole trade agreement very, very carefully. And we've been involved in discussions, ongoing discussions with them since former Minister Patel's tenure, and now Minister Tao has taken the baton with a great deal of enthusiasm. But then again, our intergovernmental working together, where Minister Patel and Minister Tao, as well as Minister Lamola, are working so closely together and bringing in other ministers. For instance, Minister George, Minister of Environmental Affairs, and other ministers will follow in tow to begin to demonstrate to the U.S. Various institutions that we are united in wanting to promote good relations with them. And it must be relations that are based on respect, mutual respect. We respect them, and they must also respect us. Minister Lamola communicated that message.
He certainly did.
Yeah,
don't tell us what to do and we won't tell you, he said.
That's right. And that for me is very correct. And they are sitting up and listening to us. So that if there are any problems, we're then able to discuss them as equals,
right.
Not one seeking to dominate the other. We are certainly a country that respects other countries, but we also want to be respected. We don't want to be dominated, and we don't want to be pushed around like we don't push any country around. So if we're treated with good respect, we will reciprocate and do exactly the same. So I do believe that the relationship is really evolving, as the Minister said, and it's dynamic, and it's becoming more stable and positive. And so we need to look forward to a much improved relationship with the United States.
Not a bromance, but a romance.
Indeed.
Mr. President, that's a good segue to a broader geopolitical discussion. Let's start with Ukraine. You have just had a bilateral meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. We know he's due to share details of his so-called victory plan with U.S. President Joe Biden. Did he share his thinking around that with you? about when this war might end? What was that discussion like? Take us into the room.
Well, President Zelensky asked for a meeting with us, and I have met him before, and we've had a number of discussions over the telephone, as we have had with President Putin. Our main theme in our discussions has been the war and bringing the war to an end with an African peace initiative in mind. So we discussed peace, how the war should end, and we did stress that we do believe, firmly believe, like the rest of the African leaders who I went accompanied to Kiev and Moscow, that every war finally ends with people sitting around a table. Whether there's a victor or a defeated party, they sit around a table. And we did say, we do believe that it's best that they really seriously embrace a peaceful settlement and get together. So our national security advisors, my national security advisor, Professor Mufamadi, and some of our officials have been involved in the various discussions with the Ukraine National Security Advisor, as well as others, to see how a peace process can be put together. We've always insisted that you cannot have peace without Russia being a part of the whole equation.
Right.
And today, that's one of the key messages I transmitted to President Zelensky.
Did he indicate any openness to that?
No. He is now becoming open to saying that there should be a peace summit, and that peace summit should also include Russia. So that, in my view, is very positive. So our national security advisors will be getting together once again to see the key elements of the proposals from Ukraine and what they believe can lead to peace, and those will also be discussed more thoroughly with our Russian colleagues. And I do believe that if we all embark on this journey with the level of genuineness that's necessary, we will be able to see some light at the end of the tunnel. It may well be a very long tunnel, because one cannot put a time frame, I've come to see now, to the end of this war, because both parties still believe that they can win on the battlefield.
Yeah, that's essentially what the Secretary General's position is at the United Nations, that he doesn't see an opening for those kinds of direct talks right now.
That's right.
As you know, Mr. President, there is, of course, an election in the United States, and Donald Trump's running mate, a guy called Senator J.D. Vance, has suggested that were they to win, they would work to establish a settlement that would grant Moscow the territory it has illegally seized since the 2022 invasion. The Secretary General has said that it was time for a just peace based on the UN Charter. He said this in the General Assembly on Tuesday, based on the UN Charter, international law, and UN resolutions, which means Russia might have to return the territory it's seized. Is that something, I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, everything is subject to negotiations. I mean, negotiations is about being able to give and take. It's about reaching a compromise. We were able to share with President Zelensky how we settled the apartheid nightmare. We settled it by parties that were pitted against each other to the death. And when they both realized that they were not able to defeat each other, that's when the penny dropped, that the only way out was to have a negotiated settlement. So negotiated settlements, by their nature and by definition, quite often lead up to interesting outcomes, which sometimes you can't predict, because...
So we shouldn't put the cart before the horse, is what
we
you're
should
saying.
never put the cart before the horse, because the interlocutors themselves, when they start, they are locked into their firm positions, but it is in the end, if they are still committed to a settlement, that they themselves will see that their positions have been changed to some extent.
So some flexibility is required from both sides,
That's
is what
right,
you're saying.
yeah.
Mr. President, the big question is one of territorial integrity, which is sacrosanct in terms of the UN Charter. You say put that to a negotiation. Isn't it settled? Isn't it settled international law?
Well, we have also said in our statements that, territorial
Right.
integrity is part of the UN Charter precepts. So that is something that also has to be put on the table, to be accepted, and to be talked about, and so that parties are then able to see how they navigate their way around all that.
You called the violence perpetrated against the Palestinian people a grim continuation of a half a century of apartheid.
Yeah.
South Africa has, of course, played a leading role in seeking to stop the conflict in Gaza, most notably through the International Court of Justice. You also, sir, met with the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan this week, who is, of course, seeking arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 leaders of Hamas, 2 of which are confirmed likely dead, and the 3rd very possibly. What did you say to Karim Khan in your capacity as South Africa's as a party to the Rome Statute?
Well, Karim Khan is a prosecutor, and we said, you must do your work. You are an independent agency.
You didn't say what's taking so long.
No, of course. We said, it is taking you long, but you must do your work. And he too has to navigate his way around a variety of matters, some organizational, some administrative, some legal, and obviously the politics also come in the way. So we were encouraging him to do his work without any fear of favor or prejudice, because that is important for any prosecutor in the world to work under that type of thinking and legal framework. So that's what he has to do. So we were giving him encouragement, of course, without telling him what to do, because we could never be in a position to tell any prosecutor, including our very own in South Africa, what they should do, because they must act independently, and they must know that they have the support of, if you like, political principles, and that they will have the assistance from an organizational point of view, from a functionary type of point of view.
We are seeing an expansion in this conflict to Israel's north, across the border with Lebanon. I saw a headline just before you walked in that Israel might very likely now be planning a ground invasion in Lebanon. The Security Council is meeting later this evening on that matter. What's your take of where we go here? I mean, the Security Council seems incapable in this moment to respond effectively. So is this a bigger role for the United States, given the leverage that they enjoy with Israel?
Well, we're now moving into extremely dangerous territory. This is much more what we feared, that the conflict in Israel and Palestine is now going to engulf many more countries. And we almost prophesied about this and said it is the reason why there must be a ceasefire, because unless there's a ceasefire, what is happening there and the slaughter of Palestinians that's continuing is going to get other parties outside to be interested in intervening on their part and showing their own disapproval. So we're in dangerous territory. And of course, we would like various countries, particularly the United States, to make an intervention to make sure that this does not spill over, as it is now, to other countries in the region. Because we could be now at a point where, unless this is stopped and what Israel is doing is stopped, we could be facing a greater calamity where many other countries then intervene, and you could have a world war quite easily.
You don't use a pager, do you, Mr. President?
No, I don't use a pager.
Many of these conflicts, of course, are allowed to fester and grow due to the current peace and security architecture that simply isn't able to meet the moment. You called, and you've done so for years, for an inclusive Security Council that gives Africa 2 permanent seats. The United States has said yes to that, but without the veto. What do you say to that?
Well, I've expressed myself on that. There is now acceptance of the participation and role that Africa, a continent of 1.4 billion people, exclusion, that it's not acceptable. and it should not be gone ahead with. So there's now acceptance that, yes, Africa should be represented. But to be represented without really having a meaningful voice at the table is really not achieving the objective that we sought. Because why should 5 countries, only 5 countries, have the total control exclusively of what happens in the world, and their voices are much more amplified than any other voice? So we demand that we should also play a key role, because the Security Council should largely be about peace, should largely be ensuring that there's development in the world, and they are failing completely to prevent wars and to stop wars.
The U.S. argument, the Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield at the U.S., she made this announcement, and I challenged her on it, and the response was, well, we don't want to give up the veto because it's just going to create more dysfunction. And the pushback is, well, if it's dysfunctional, why not just get rid of it? And they're like, well, we don't want to give it up. And none of the P5 essentially want to do that, because you're essentially voting to give power, your power, to others, or to do away with it. I mean, this is a fight that you're going to have. If the argument in terms of the Eswini consensus is in terms of common justice, if you have it and you want us to be permanent, well, then we should have it too. But they're saying no. What does that conversation look like?
Well, you see, we're making progress. In the past, they never countenanced the involvement of other non-5 members to be part of the Security Council on a permanent basis. So we've moved. But we say, no, that is not enough. It's not sufficient. It's like having half a loaf of bread when you know that you need the full loaf of bread to feed yourself. So we want the full right of participation like the 5. And if they say it will be dysfunctional if we include others, but it basically is an admission that what they have is completely dysfunctional, and therefore it should be reformed. And that's the heart of our message, that they should be reformed in the UN Security Council. And let it be known that we are going to continue insisting on that. And we are going to insist on saying the United Nations is not fulfilling its role. And it's an archaic body.
Right.
That stems from 1945. And we're now in 2024, many, many years later. So it should be reformed to also include the interests of other worlds. And we were colonized, or nearly all of Africa was colonized. So now we are nation states that should have equal participation and consideration.
Our time is up. I have one quick question, Mr. President. Is it time that Africa shows its hand in terms of who the 2 countries are going to be that are going to take those permanent seats? Who's it going to be? Is it time that Africa shows its hand?
Well, the African Union is going to have to take that decision.
When is that going to happen?
Well, once the process moves on, I mean, it will reach a maturity point at a particular time. And the AU is the only body in Africa that will take that decision.
And South Africa wants one of those seats, right?
Well, we want to play a role in, continue playing a role in world affairs. And whatever the decision is in the end, it will be the AU decision.
Ever the diplomat, Cyril Ramaphosa, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed. South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking to us exclusively at the conclusion of his visit to the United Nations General Assembly, his engagement with business in New York. He has a plane to catch.